in the end.
Acquire was best known early on for the first two Tenchu games on the PS1. However, not long after Tenchu 2, Birth of the Stealth Assassins was released, Activision acquired the full rights to the franchise. They published the first two games outside of Japan, while Sony Music Entertainment published the first game in Japan. Acquire published the second game themselves in Japan. Activision was very happy with the sales of the first two games, and they went and purchased the franchise from SME. This left Acquire out in the dust with not much to do, so they decided to make a game based on another stable of Japanese sword wielders, the Samurai. Assumably, work on Way of the Samurai began after Tenchu 2 was released. The PS2 was just around the corner in the rest of the world, and Acquire thought that this would be the perfect console to debut this game. A little more than a year after Tenchu 2 was released, Acquire announced Way of the Samurai for the PS2 and announced it would take a different approach to Tenchu, a straight-up action game with some exciting new mechanics that became prevalent in a certain genre later on. At the time, there was no word on a North American release, but the same month the Japanese version came out, the game's North American release was announced. Way of the Samurai, known in Japan as just Samurai, was developed by Acquire and published by Spike in Japan, BAM Entertainment in North America, and Eidos in PAL territories. The game was released in Japan on February 7, 2002, May 30, 2002 for North America, and September 13, 2002 for PAL territories on the PS2. An updated version was released in Japan on January 16, 2003 under the name Samurai Kanzaban or Samurai Complete Edition. This version had improvements for the North American version, such as bug fixes, a hard mode, horizontal text, and non-sword weapons amongst some other things. There was also a PSP version released on September 18, 2008 in Japan only. This was before the third game came out. Way of the Samurai may look like a simple action game on the surface in the same vein of games like Onimusha, but when you go beyond the initial look, there's actually a lot more here than expected, and as a result, we have a bit of an underrated action game. Way of the Samurai's story takes place in 1878 after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the beginning of the Meiji period. You play as a wandering ronin named Kenji, who arrives in a fictional outpost-like town called Rokotsu Pass. The town is best known for having a railway crossing, a small restaurant, and an iron foundry. 3 factions want control of the pass, and each of them has their own goal in mind. There's the new government, who's been getting power from the warlords, and they have modern weaponry for its time, including the likes of guns and cannons. The Kuro family had previous sway and enforced their influence by extortion and intimidation. They're resisting the government's hostile takeover, but they can't compete with the guns and cannons of the army, so to get money for better weapons, they want to sell the iron foundry to the government. Finally, there's the Akadama clan. Their leader, Kicho, is the illegitimate son of the Kuro family's leader, Tesshin Kuro. The Akadama wants the government out of the pass, and they want to sabotage the Kuro's sale of the foundry. With the village people caught up in this, it's up to Kenji to navigate this madness and bring peace to it all, or something like that. When you start the game, you can customize options for face and outfit, and even rename the character if you want to. You can also select your sword. This is important since the better your sword, combat won't be too much trouble. Each sword has 4 stats. Sharpness affects the amount of damage dealt to an opponent, flexibility affects how much damage is suffered by the player, durability, how much heat the sword can handle before it breaks, heat is generated by striking or blocking, and life affects how much health can be given. Once you select, you're dropped into the game. You can move around freely and find items that increase your health, and maybe other items to boot. But it's not long before you find the first scenario of a woman getting kidnapped. This is where the game's most unique aspect comes into play: the decision-making system. In what's pretty much a prelude to many Quantic Dreams games like Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain, or even Telltale games like The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us, you can make a choice that will impact the story at certain points. Like this first one here. You can help the girl, join the abductors, or watch as an observer. So while there is still an overarching plot that is pretty much the same each time you play, certain events can play out differently, depending on the choices you make, on top of interacting with various characters and what you say to them. In short, The game has 6 endings depending on which faction, if any, you ally yourself with, and the choices you make. When you aren't walking and talking to various NPCs, you'll be engaged in combat, depending on the choices you make. All combat is done with swords, and the game has over 40 different types. You have a regular attack, a strong attack, a block, and a kick. You can use the attacks in various combinations for different combos that can help make combat easier. You'll often fight more than one opponent at a time. When you defeat an important opponent, you can take their sword and put it in your inventory to maybe use later. That also allows you to unlock special attacks and combinations that belong to certain weapons. You can also find special items to unlock these. Depending on the sword, you may have a different fighting style, but the general idea is the same across the board. You can only carry up to 3 swords at a time, but you can offload one of them once per game with the swordsmith Dojima, and it will go to your collection. Once per game may seem like a big deal, but it's really not, and that's because the game is a bit short. One playthrough of the game takes about an hour, maybe longer for new players. This also depends on the difficulty you select. Hard will take longer than normal and easy, and with how much there is, you might be here longer than expected, especially if you throw in the tutorial. The controls here work well. Each action works well for non-fighting actions and fighting actions, but it does feel a bit more intense since these aren't fights like your average hack and slash. You will have to have some patience. If anything, it feels more like a fighting game mixed with a beat 'em up, or slash 'em up in this case. But here, enemies fight you one at a time, so it's never too overwhelming, and since you have a pretty good grasp on the controls, the combat I would say is pretty good. Just be prepared for something a bit different. The game's graphics are a bit basic in parts. Given that this title was probably in development as far back as late 2000, I can't fault it on its looks too much, but some of the environmental color palette does feel a bit muted, with a bit more blander colors per se, but non-environmental colors on the outfits and things like that would look well. The textures for characters and stuff like that looks fine, but it's not overly detailed and it won't blow you away. You might even notice some aliasing and jagged edges in parts. Building textures and designs do look fine, and where the game lacks in graphical prowess, it excels in art style. You really do feel like you're in ancient Japan, and for a small town, the Rokotsu Pass does have a lot of interesting places to look at. Shogun armor and other things look fine for the most part, and the game does run at a rock-solid 60 frames per second. The look will blow you away like some of the other PS2 games, but it gets the job done. The sound design in this game is on point. The musical score for this game consists of various instrumental riffs and motifs made from instruments during this area, taiko drums and stuff like that. The game's sound effects also work. Combat sounds as it should, footsteps sound good, and menu sound effects are good. I think you get the idea. If I'm being honest, there's not much more I can say about the sound, cause yeah, even the voice acting is kinda basic. While you do have grunt sounds and other combat voice reactions, the actual in-game dialogue isn't spoken much. If anything, it's sort of like Banjo-Kazooie and the like, but without any of the jibber-jabber like speak to them. But I guess it works. With 6 endings to the game and over 40 sword types to collect, there is plenty of replayability to keep you coming back for more, on top of the game's multiplayer, which is the only game in the franchise to have a multiplayer mode. Way of the Samurai is a surprisingly enjoyable action game that takes a much different approach to something like Onimusha Warlords, but it succeeds well in its original approach and provides a different but good experience. It controls well, looks well for the most part, and has a pretty interesting environment, and a multiplayer mode on top of it to boot, and it's just a very unique game. However, it's not a graphical powerhouse like other PS2 games. Some color palettes are a bit muted, and the game itself can feel like a one-and-done game to boot. But you won't probably see everything it has to offer by playing it like this. This type of weekend rental would give you just enough to see what the game had to offer, but still had more should you want to buy it. Alas, rentals aren't much of an option in this day and age, so CIB copies go for about $20, less for PAL and Japan. That's pretty much what it was going for when it came out, since it was a budget title, and I say go for it at that price if you're looking for something a bit more different in terms of PS2 middle-of-the-road action games. I give Way of the Samurai a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, click the big red button below to subscribe. Check out the other links in the description for more cool stuff, and check out the playlist on screen for more content. See you in the next video.